Has anybody ever asked you what your IQ is? I hate that question. So did this gentleman, David Wechsler. He came to the U.S. From Romania when he was 6 years old, and he took the Stanford Binet test, and the Stanford Binet test concluded that he was feeble-minded. In other words, well below average in intelligence. That test couldn't be more wrong. Dr. Wechsler earned his bachelor's degree at City College in New York City and his PhD at Columbia University. He revised and created modern intelligence testing and is one of the most famous psychologists on the planet. So, not very feeble-minded. He worked for a while at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, and while he was there, he developed most of modern intelligence testing. His definition of intelligence refers to your ability to act with purpose, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with your surroundings. He developed two kinds of intelligence tests, one for adults and one for children, where children in this case are defined as people aged 16. And his tests broke down intelligence measures into these different subscales. He had both verbal and nonverbal IQ scores. The nonverbal IQ scores obviously didn't require a particular language. So someone who was not fluent in English could still excel in nonverbal tests of intelligence. This was an important thing for Dr. Wechsler. He measured things like working memory capacity, how much information you could hold at one time and use, how well you could perceptually organize images, how well you could organize stories, how quickly you could make decisions, those sorts of things. And based on Wechsler's tests, we have something that you see here called a bell curve. Remember when we talked about normal distributions? IQ is a classic normal distribution. Now, IQ tests, again, are always set up so the mean, the median, and the mode are 100, right in the middle. And about 90% of people fall within a very tight range of 30 points. So someone may tell you that they have an IQ of 200. That's pretty hard to believe. The average college student has an IQ by these measures of about 120. This curve and these analyses were based on the results of giving the Wechsler intelligence tests to thousands of people and standardizing the tests so that everything was distributed normally. What do IQs below average, below 100 mean? Well, if someone has an IQ below 20, then it's concluded that that person needs constant 24-hour oversight and assistance. If someone has an IQ of somewhere between 35 and 50, then the assumption is that they can function at about the level of a second grader. If someone has an IQ of around 50 to 70, the assumption there is that they can function up to about the level of a sixth grader. When it comes to any psychological measure, you have to look at two concepts, reliability and validity. You know reliability if you have a car that sometimes doesn't want to start. If you have a reliable car, then every time you go to start the car, it starts up. If you have an unreliable car, then every time you get in the front seat and turn on the ignition, you're praying that it'll start because you don't know. So in testing, in IQ testing, reliability is the following. If I give you an IQ test today and I give you an IQ test next week, will your score be the same or will it vary dramatically? The Stanford Binet IQ tests and the Wechsler IQ test have very good reliability. People can take them over and over and they generally get scores that are very, very close to their original score. Now the concept of validity. It's one thing for a measure to be reliable, to give you the same answer every time. but is the measure valid? Does it measure what you think it measures? This is a question that smart people really struggle with when it comes to the IQ test. This is a big issue. So, for example, in the state of California, standardized testing is sort of going by the wayside as more universities realize that SAT and ACT tests are not very predictive of success in college. Same thing with the GRE exam. The scores are not very predictive of success in graduate school. So we don't really know what IQ tests measure. We know they have something to do with how affluent your family is, your family's socioeconomic status, but that's different from intelligence. How in the world do you define intelligence? Well, you might ask the smartest people in the world. And when Stephen Hawking was asked what his IQ was, his response was, and I quote, "I have no idea. People who boast about their IQs are losers." Albert Einstein, when he was asked about intelligence, concluded, "Everyone is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." In other words, you better have the right measure for intelligence if that's what you think you're measuring. Okay, come right back and we'll talk about whether intelligence is one thing or many things.